The so-called Freedom Convoy has certainly put political populism on our radar screens in Canada as never before. But a new book suggests these kinds of populist spasms aren't necessarily the result of a villainous electorate, but rather the condescending, non-empathetic response from mainstream politics and society. Paul Somerville is co-author of Reclaiming Populism: How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters, and he joins us now from Victoria, British Columbia, with some ideas about what we can do about all of this. Paul, it's good to see you again. It's been too long since you were last on this program, so great to have you back.
Thanks for having me back, Steve. It's great to be here.
Now, let's also stipulate that you wrote this book well before all of the current drama in Ottawa and other places happened. So let's point out that when you wrote this book, populist anger had really overflowed, I guess, with Donald Trump's election in the United States. But you made the point in the book that somehow Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had mostly managed to avoid those similar kinds of populist spasms. We can't say that anymore now, can we?
Oh, I think we can. I think, in fact, what we demonstrated in the book was that what happened in the United States with Trump, what happened with Brexit, other places, France, Italy, Eastern Europe, that the populist eruptions there were the consequence of long brewing discontent that we make the claim has to do very much with economic unfairness, that countries where people can't get ahead, and this is certainly the case in the United States where the American dream is broken, very much the case in the UK where getting ahead really depends on where you live, in France and Italy where inefficient markets make it difficult for people, even if they are well educated and have the will to be successful, find it hard to get ahead. Then in all of those cases, what economists call social mobility is low, and that this has been building up for a very long period of time. Whereas countries where you have high social mobility, where you can get ahead, Canada is one of those countries, fortunately, you're very unlikely to have any sustained populist eruption. And by that, we mean really a fundamental change in what the country looks like. Post-Trump, post-Brexit, these countries are very different than what they were 5 years ago. Something fundamentally has changed. And our argument would be, if we were writing a book about what's going on right now in Canada, we would say that we've seen similar types of political discontent in the Nordic countries, for example, where social mobility is very high, where you can get ahead. During the 2015 migrant crisis, there was huge fears in Stockholm and in Copenhagen and other Nordic countries that the populist wave had come to those countries. And in fact, after a brief moment of real political discontent, by the time we got to 2020, 21, all the elections results demonstrate that populist parties in those countries poll at anywhere from 50 to 70% below other European countries. So our argument would be what's going on in Canada is a very natural expression of political discontent after a 2-year pandemic. There's a very specific group of people who are anti-vax, who are anti-mandate, have certain grudges against government. But our argument would be that once the blockades are dismantled, that this will fade as a memory in Canada. We're not going to see some political realignment that's going to create the kind of political disruption, institutional disruption that we've seen in the United States and in the UK.
Okay, let me jump in here. Right, I know where you're going next, but I want to pick up on a couple of quotes you put in the book because you juxtapose them, and they're both pretty famous quotes. So I'll repeat them here and then come out of it with a question. Here's the first quote: "Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and factories closed. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer." That, of course, Donald Trump when he was campaigning for president in 2016. Juxtapose that with, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? They're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it, they are irredeemable. That was the Democratic challenger, Hillary Clinton. What are you trying to say by juxtaposing those two quotes in your book in the way that you did?
Well, what we're trying to say is that the populist complaint in places like the United States, in places like the UK, is very legitimate. That these complaints need to be understood and they need to be defined very precisely. And our argument is that the populist complaint is deeply rooted in economic unfairness, that these are countries where the last 30 or 40 years, it's been very difficult to get ahead. Either you don't have the tools, in places like the United States, for example, where we would argue that the American middle class lives over a trap door that can be sprung by an accident, ill health, or unemployment. Or in countries like France, for example, where markets are very inefficient. The Economist magazine had a great data point that barbers in Paris have to do 200 haircuts a month just to pay the taxes that they owe. So in these countries, economic unfairness deeply rooted in a very long period of time that affects a lot of people. And so these are complaints we need to understand. We need to articulate. We can't talk about, we've got to be very careful if you're a mainstream political party, if you want to win back these voters, be very careful the kind of language you use to describe who they are. And Trump and other populist leaders are very good about framing the conversation around populism, where they amplify the economic discontent by talking about outgroups, talking about immigration, talking about unfair trade policy. They amplify that and then make the case that the political opposition has no political legitimacy, that they're the only ones who can deliver the goods for people who are disenfranchised. So it was very important to make it very clear. You've got to be very careful to take these populist complaints seriously and not just pass them off.
Well, if language is important, let me hone in on a couple of different expressions you use and find out what the difference is between them. You've mentioned economic unfairness. It's in the title of your book. Economic inequality, you also refer to that. What's the difference?
Well, we're very clear in our book to differentiate between equal opportunity and equal outcomes. We make the case that countries where the state provides equal opportunity through a number of things, not just the obvious ones like education and health, but legal protections, taxation, to fund giving people the tools they need to be successful, that this is a very different thing. And it's a very important thing, and it's something we support from equalizing outcomes. That equalizing outcomes is very dangerous. It's proved to create authoritarian, often criminal states, and that people need to be able to be rewarded for their contribution through what we call fair, unequal outcomes. That unequal outcomes in a social democracy are very, very important for social mobility. They're critical to create high social mobility and successful social democracies.
Well, in fact, I think, Paul, you go further than that in the book. You say that people are essentially perfectly fine with unequal economic outcomes as long as they feel they got, some skin in the game and they got a shot at the big dream. Fair to say?
Well, yes, this was, I think, one of the most important conclusions that we came to in the early stages. So Eric and I started writing the book in January 2019, and we did a research review, we did a literature review. And as we worked through the literature, it became very clear that the idea of fairness, the idea of economic fairness was becoming very important in the conversation and needed to be applied to thinking about populism. And one of the most important conclusions we came from that by looking at some of the literature that talks about how children think about fairness, how voters think about fairness, is that people prize fair, unequal outcomes. They prize fairness. They're very opposed to imposed equalized outcomes. A very good example is how unsuccessful Jeremy Corbyn was in the 2019 election, where he thought that by offering a program of equalizing outcomes, very aggressive redistribution, that he would attract a lot of support. And in fact, that didn't happen. And anywhere that's been tried, partly as a response to the populist push, the left wing of the Democratic Party, for example, in the United States, it's been an utter failure. Human beings are deeply, deeply supportive. It's in our DNA for fair outcomes.
I thank you for setting the table for the discussion to come, which happens right now. We're going to bring two more voices into our conversation now. So, joining us on Manhattan Island in New York City, Miles Korek, professor of economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and in our nation's capital, probably not that far from all the stuff that's been going on for the last few weeks, there's Armin Yalnizyan, economist and Atkinson Fellow on the future of workers. And we welcome Miles and Armin back to our program. I want to start by pulling a quote here from Paul's book. Here we go. "It cannot be overstated," he writes, "how important it is for liberal politicians to get off the bandwagon of equal outcomes and identity politics and talk about fairness instead." So, Miles, let's pick up on that. Where do you stand on Paul's claim that if populism is to be disarmed, fairness, not equality of outcome, ought to be at the heart of our politics and policy? What say you?
Well, I think it's a very smartly written book. And overall, I think the distinction between inequality that's fair and inequality that's not fair is something important he's brought to the public policy literature. But I think we have to hold a number of thoughts in our mind. It's not just fairness and as an aspect of inequality that matters. It's also the nature of economic growth and social mobility. It's all three of those things that come together. What I find helpful is to sort of think of an escalator. All of us are sort of sitting on the first stairs of the escalator, probably on different stairs. And what do we expect to happen? We expect over the coming years, the coming decades, the next generation to move up that escalator. There has to be economic growth that goes with that. But a sense of prosperity is brought about by the fact that the distance we stand between each other is not too great, and there's shuffling around in our rankings. So, and that's what Paul means by social mobility. If I started on the bottom stair at the bottom, I may end up at the bottom once economic growth has happened. So, what's happened in Canada? That escalator for about the bottom 40% of the population has turned out to be a treadmill. Economic growth hasn't delivered to them the kind of progress, the kind of hope that they imagine for themselves and their children. What's happened in Canada is our distance between us has increased so that the consequences of falling down a stair or two are much greater. This leads to polarized growth, not shared prosperity. And this is what makes people look over their shoulder and wonder and worry. So we need growth that's a benefit to all, relative equality of outcomes, and ability to move around those stairs when it really doesn't matter so much because the distances aren't that great. And over the last generation, we haven't seen that. So I just bring that kind of nuance to Paul's discussion, that it's growth, it's income rankings, and it's income inequality that all matter.
Okay, we're going to get Armin to weigh in on this issue of equality of outcome versus fairness, unfairness of economic opportunity, and then we'll give Paul a chance to respond to both of you. Go ahead, Armin.
Wow, what a rich discussion, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of it. I'm going to actually focus on the title of the book, Reclaiming Populism. And the notion that populism isn't primarily driven by economic fairness, which is the claim, or even the left behinds. The idea that more separates us from top to bottom or left to right or identity like black or white, I don't think is the right frame. I think within every one of these groups, we've got a spectrum of interests. I think the abiding animus behind populism right now is the idea of the insider-outsider status. Who's making decisions about me for me? The fact that there are people in the Freedom Convoy that have appropriated the language of my body, my choice, which was what brought me into feminism in the 60s and 70s, it's just like passing weird to have that kind of identity politics taken over by white men that are angry that anybody's telling them what to do. So, and I also view populism as a complete and utter dead end. If you go back to the response to the Arab Spring, everywhere populism has taken place, it's been a way of channeling grievance, but it's about taking apart the status quo. It's not about building something new. And it's not surprising because everywhere it's about mistrust of the systems that exist being able to deliver for you. That, as I think Paul said, those people are not speaking for me. Those people are not me. So to Miles' point, absolutely shared growth, inclusive growth is the formula out of here. But how do you do it when more and more people are self-identifying in tribes that are about us against them, and when politicians themselves are wrapping themselves up in the idea that I'm the only one that can save you from this nonsense, but they're not actually offering solutions that bring everybody along. I think we're in a very troubled moment. And I would add one final thought, which is the populism we are seeing today and have been seeing for weeks with the so-called Freedom Convoy is also AstroTurf populism. It's being financed by people who want smaller government or no government. And so it is a continuation of a very libertarian philosophy that more markets and less government are the way to go, but it is literally being financed rather than an upswelling from people. And I think we need to be very careful about the misinformation that's out there that is fanning the flames of this so-called populism.
When you say AstroTurf, you mean fake grassroots, not the real deal.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay, Paul, lots of good feedback there to your book. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think I'd like to start by making the very important point that fairness is a moving target. Just because, in our view, Canada, the Nordics, Australia, New Zealand do much better from a social mobility perspective, are kind of inoculated, to use a phrase, against populist eruptions that fundamentally change the country. The fact is that fairness is a moving target because of the way that new technologies impact the structure of the economy and create big winners and big losers. And the whole point of the political system is that the political system then begins to create policies to mitigate the differences between the winners and the losers. If it does that, then I think you'll have evolution, you'll have a positive change, you'll have high social mobility. But if the political system doesn't do that, and we argue that in the United States and the UK specifically, those political systems did not react to the powerful technological changes from globalization, China trade, and the technology shocks of the last 15 years, that you end up with a hereditary ruling class that begins to believe that they have a right to their status and to their power and begin to rewrite the rules of politics for their own benefit. And we see this really very much in the United States. So fairness is a moving target, and it's very important that we understand how technology changes the structure of the economy. The second thing is that, and I'm glad Armin picked up with the title of our book, I'm a big fan of a book written about Japan called Embracing Defeat. And we wanted a kind of a powerful verb in the title. And the original title of our book was Defeating Populism when we first started thinking about it. But it became very clear as we maybe perhaps started to empathize and sympathize with the populist complaint around economic unfairness. Again, that Americans live over a trapdoor that can be sprung by a number of different things that we kind of take for granted that you're going to be taken care of in Canada. We changed the title with the advice of our editor in the UK with Polity Books of Reclaiming Populism. And remember that the underlying thesis of the book is how to win back disenchanted voters, how to give mainstream politicians the language and the tools to bring back people who feel marginalized, who feel that there's a clique, as Armin says, that basically write the rules for them that they have no part and they don't benefit from. So what we're arguing, particularly in chapters 4 and 5, is there's a number of very powerful tools that mainstream politicians can use if they take the claims of populist voters, disenchanted voters seriously, that you can reclaim the populist vote and bring it back to create a more inclusive, pluralist, pro-democratic country.
Understood. Miles, in some respects, I hate to bring the convoy back into this thing because there are so many different agendas going on in different locations that it's hard to know. But let's just say, I mean, surely Irene is correct. Part of this is, don't tell me what to do with my body. I'll on the whole vaccine issue. But part of it surely is there are a number of people who feel as if the economy has moved right along and right past them, and that the social mobility that they once thought was part of the Canadian dream is no longer there. That's certainly some people's agenda in the convoy. We've heard it. We've heard it from a number of people who've lost their jobs and who think that the Canadian dream is not part of their particular reality anymore. And I guess the question is, if they're right, what went wrong?
If they're right, what went wrong? To some degree, they are right. Statistics Canada, for example, has shown that somewhere around 50% of children are doing better than their parents. If they're right, what went wrong? Two things. One, as Paul alluded to, it's the nature of growth. What happened is, as we grabbed onto this globalism agenda, this neoliberal agenda in the 80s and 90s, opening up the economy, an economy that was hit with major changes in the way we work, with the power of computing. What went wrong is some people had to compete head on with the computer. If you do routine jobs, like think of your stereotypical factory worker who would have a piece of machinery move across him and he would weld a joint. Well, robots do that now. Think of middle managers whose major job was to process information, to move it from the shop floor to upper management. Well, Excel spreadsheets can do that now. So people who were doing routine jobs went head to head in competition with the computer, and they lost out. They lost out in status, and that impacted their identity as well. One of the things that I would pair with this book is a recent book by Michael Sandel called The Tyranny of Merit.
Oh, we had him on this program talking about that book. It's a great one.
That's right. And so what he also points out, as Paul has just said, the thing about inequality, it engenders entitlement amongst those at the top. It fosters shame amongst those at the bottom, and it creates insecurity for everybody in the middle. So this gets wrapped up with identity as well. And this is where I sort of disagree with Paul. If you just sort of move into a prescription of more social mobility, it depends upon how identity politics gets layered onto that. You talked about that famous quote of Hillary Clinton's. What went wrong is we didn't value the work that people now do in any way. We didn't recognize their dignity. What could be worse for a lot of males who did work that was more routine, whose identity was wrapped up with being a provider, than to have a highly educated urban woman tell them that they're deplorable? And so then that opens up a whole different identity politics. Two things went wrong. We didn't pay enough attention to people who can't get an education. We kept telling them, get more education. And if they can't, then they're perceived as losers. So it was the economy mixing up with a type of rhetoric that engendered entitlement, created shame, fostered insecurity.
Gotcha. That's a very nice summation of where we're at. Armin, I wonder if you could pick up the baton at this point and say, if social mobility has been and is a problem in this country right now, maybe not as big a problem as in other countries, but it's not good enough for a lot of people still. Could you give us a few policy prescriptions that you think might improve social mobility in the country?
Yeah, but can I just refer to one comment about the role of technology driving some of this sentiment of being left behind?
Fire away.
Is that okay? Because in the wake of every wave of technological change, we have seen more jobs, not fewer jobs. In the wake of every wave of technological change, what technology does is unbundle tasks from jobs. It doesn't always displace the job entirely. And frankly, part of what Trump rode in on. The horse he rode in on is he was going to bring the jobs back from China. That wasn't technology. That was just a cheaper you on the other side of the world. And container technology that brought it cheaply to you as a consumer, it tore you apart as a human being by pitting you as a consumer who wants the cheapest thing possible against you as a worker who wants the best wages possible. So if we're going to talk about inclusive growth as part of the solution, I think you need to be looking at the actual truckers who are vaccinated and who are experiencing wage theft. 90% of them are vaccinated, or between 85 and 90% of them are vaccinated. And the biggest issue the truckers have in Canada right now is that many of them are temporary foreign workers who are experiencing wage theft. Why are there so many temporary foreign workers? Because Canadian workers are thinking that there's going to be driverless trucks. Technology is going to take over those jobs, and there's no future in those jobs. They're actually quite good paying when the wages aren't stolen. And what we need to be doing is talking about how we make every job a good job in an era of population aging. You know, populism in an era of population aging could be leading to making more jobs better jobs, could be leading to making the best benefits are portable benefits. As we learned with our healthcare system, you compare the American auto industry to the Canadian, and we've got a huge edge, not just because our workers are better educated and can do the job just as well as the Americans, but because the employers don't have to pay for healthcare. So we've got a real issue on understanding how the social infrastructure we offer one another becomes the platform on which we build a more inclusive economy where more people are benefiting from growth because they're getting something back from it. They're not just contributing to higher productivity and more profits. They're actually seeing quality of life improving, whether it's through wages or through services that they can access, high quality service they can access at low cost. For example, early learning and childcare, which is a huge breakthrough, but the first one in a generation, 2 generations, 50 years, the first time we are talking systemically about how we give everybody more opportunity and a higher standard of living by doing it together for one another through the public purse. And I think that's a conversation that is just going to rub a lot of people the wrong way after 40 years of being told more market, less government is the solution. I think we are in an era where we're going to have to rely more on governments. And I think a lot of people are very nervous about that proposition and see it as a form of socialism when it's a form of actually taking care of one another more effectively so we can get about the business of growing the economy, if that's what turns your crank.
Paul, your comments on that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, when Michael Sandell's book came out, Eric and I wrote a letter to the New York Times where we argued that, in fact, what we thought Sandell was talking about, because he was mostly focused on the United States, was not that meritocracy was a bad thing, that he was talking about how America was failing at meritocracy, not a failure of meritocracy. We actually think meritocracy is absolutely needs to be at the center of any successful country that wants to have high social mobility. And off of our means comments, absolutely. A fair economy is rooted in intelligent public policy. Again, we called it the twin virtues of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. And right now, we need more of the equal opportunity. We need it partly because of the way the economy has shifted. Our book wasn't specifically about Canada, but I would say that in the last year or so, the adoption of universal childcare in Canada is an absolutely fundamental part of that public policy prescription. Steve, you'll know that I decided in 2006 to run for the NDP. I was recruited by Jack Layton. And the reason was I was furious with Paul Martin in 2000 and 2001 when it was clear that Canada was going to have huge surpluses. They decided to cut corporate taxes. In fact, you asked Jack Layton in the leaders' debate about the decision not to cut corporate taxes, and he quoted my name, which scared me to no end. The point is that I felt very strongly at the time, and unfortunately, it's 20 years too late, but better late than never, that Canada's doing some of the right things around this. But again, to Miles' point, there is evidence that many countries that have high levels of social mobility, we speak about it in chapter 4 of our book, as far as Norway is concerned, how new technologies are constraining social mobility in a number of countries that have enjoyed high levels. So again, fairness is a moving target. Social mobility is something that's difficult to achieve, but it's a combination of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes.
You actually have a more interesting political background than you let on there, because not only did you run for the NDP, you're a former Bay Street big bank economist, and you also ran for National Policy Chair of the Liberal Party of Canada. You've taken an interesting political journey along the way. How has all of that, you're dabbling in a variety of political partisan outfits and jobs as well, how's that helped inform what you've got in the pages of this book?
Well, I've been thinking about this book for 30 years. I know we talked about it 5 or 6 years ago. My parents didn't graduate from high school. I was born in the UK, raised in Toronto. I got a good education, never had to worry about healthcare. I ended up being in Japan, doing my PhD there. And then when I graduated, I went into investment banking, global finance. And around the age of 35 or 36, I became very wealthy. And when I reflected on how that was possible, I mean, sure, I worked hard and there was a lot of discipline and sacrifice. But the fact is, without all of the advantages that I had for being Canadian, that would have never occurred to me. That would have never happened. And coming back to Canada in 1995 and working on Bay Street, I met a lot of people who had the same background as me, but they were a lot less convinced that it had to do with Canada and it had more to do with the market and with their good luck. And so I felt very strongly that I wanted to bring that conversation, that personal experience to public life. And that's why when I was approached by Jack Layton, I decided to, man bite dog, run for the NDP and try to make the case that hope and prosperity were the two things that could define how we could think about Canada. And I think that's expressed itself in the book, equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes.
Well, we hope this discussion, which Myles and Armin, we thank you for contributing to, has whetted our viewers and listeners' appetite for more. For more, you can read Reclaiming Populism, How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters by Eric Protzer and our guest, Paul Somerville. My thanks to the three of you for joining us on TVO tonight. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.